The legends of America's mobs are woven into the fabric of society and pop culture. We've all seen the movies or heard the tales of these criminal organizations. Their stories of power, wealth, respect, family, greed, betrayal, violence, murder, and mayhem. While the golden age of the mobs may be over, organized crime continues to thrive, and the stories remain as infamous as ever. You're listening to the Gangland History Podcast, hosted by mob historian Jacob Stoops. He tells the true crime biographies of real-life mobsters and dives deep into the plots, subplots, and real facts behind organized crime in America. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Gangland History Podcast. I am your host, mob historian Jacob Stoops. We've got a very special episode today in which we interview Ray Franze, author of the historical mob fiction book, The Heights. The Heights is based upon the true story of an Italian immigrant who ruthlessly fought his way into Al Capone's inner circle and expanded organized crime across the American West. In the book, that man is Salvatore Liparello. In real life, well, you'll just have to hear it from the author. In this interview, Ray Franze is going to share with us what it's like writing historical fiction and how he was able to blend the real history of the boys from the Heights with the fictional story of Salvatore Sal Liparello and his bloody rise to running the Chicago Heights wing of the Chicago outfit, which historically has been one of the main seats of power of the real-life Chicago outfit mob family. I've read The Heights, and I can honestly say it is one of the more interesting mob books that I've read, as you kind of get a sense of what it might have been like to be there talking to an Al Capone, Tony Accardo, or other major players of the era. This book doesn't just give you some of the history, but it gives you the human perspective behind what it must have been like to have lived it. It's a very unique take on the mob in Chicago, and simply put, it's a must-read for all of you mob aficionados out there. We certainly have the holidays coming up, so put it on your list of books to buy and books to read for yourself or for your loved ones for the holidays. The link will be in the show notes below to go purchase the book. And now, on to our interview with Ray Franze. This is his story in his own words. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Gangland History Podcast. I am here with Ray Franze, author of The Heights. We're excited to do a different kind of episode today. It's going to blend a little bit of historical fiction, getting an idea of what it's like to actually be, the one writing the content, what it's like to write a book. And we're going to teach you a little bit about the history of Chicago Heights. Welcome to the show, Ray.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Jake. I appreciate it.
Ray, so I'm really excited to have you on the show because I myself am an aspiring author, would love to write a book at some point. So I'm definitely interested in the process, but I'm also a historian. So I'm very much interested in the history of the outfit, specifically in this case, Chicago Heights. And I'm really excited to get into it. So I'm definitely thinking our audience is really going to appreciate this episode. It's going to be a bit of a different one from my typical documentary style, but I think it's going to be, a nice value add, especially for those that are interested in what goes into actually writing a book. So why don't we just go ahead and get started?
Awesome.
So Ray, if you wouldn't mind, just can you give us a little bit about your background? Where did you grow up? What's your family background? What was your upbringing like, just to set the stage?
Absolutely. Well, I'm 52 years old, and I grew up in Arlington Heights, which is a northwest suburb of Chicago, about maybe 25 miles. My parents and grandparents were born and raised in Chicago Heights, which is about 30 miles directly south of Chicago, on the Indiana border. And when my parents got married in the early mid-60s, they kind of migrated to the northwest suburbs. And my sisters and I grew up there. My dad worked for Montgomery Ward for 30 years. And and went to University of Iowa, and I've been trading on Chicago's stock exchanges and option exchanges since 1994.
A lot of people don't know. It's interesting that you mentioned Ohio, and anybody that has followed the podcast for a while knows that I'm kind of a Midwest guy as well. In the Big Ten, Iowa, a Big Ten school. My Big Ten school would be the Ohio State University, but a lot of people don't know Iowa had a mob presence, and I know we certainly had not planned on getting into that, but a lot of people don't know Des Moines, Iowa had a presence stemming from the outfit. That's another story for another day. So let's fast forward. At some
Okay.
point, you, I'm going to guess you've living in the Heights, you've run up against the mob a little bit, and that probably is the thing that piques your curiosity to write a book. So at what point did you come to the decision not just to write about the outfit, but to write in historical fiction, which is
Sure.
a totally different style
Yeah.
than you typically get in this genre?
Yeah. So growing up in Arlington Heights, no interaction with any organized crime at all. Like I said, my dad worked for Montgomery Ward, but when my grandparents would sometimes come over or there'd be a family gathering, every once in a while when you're a little kid, you might hear, you know, your family talking about so and so and so and so. So, for me, that would have been early 80s. So,
Mhm.
by then, a lot of the things that my parents grew up around and my grandparents were around kind of already were winding down. Um, so I really didn't grow around anything organized crime at all. If I brought it up to my parents when I was in elementary school, it was, it's a terrible thing. They're criminals, so I was actually brought up with like disdain in a family that like showed disdain toward it. Um, I would say by the time I was in college, um, I started really having a better understanding for um, some of the historical figures, just some of the people that like I had heard about at family gatherings. Um, come up, newspaper articles might come up in the late '80s, and you'd see familiar names. You're like, oh God, that name sounds kind of familiar. Um, and then I would say in the '90s, right when the internet hit, Jake.
Hmm.
As soon as I could do a Google internet search, I started throwing in Chicago Heights names that I was familiar with. And that kind of was kind of like a bombshell for me. I kind of was like, what am I going to find next? Okay. Um, and then I have a cousin, Matt Luzzi, who wrote a nonfiction historical press about the boys in the Heights. And Luke Corsino, who's a professor at North Central College, sociology professor, he also wrote a nonfiction book about the outfit that I read. Those two books, which I list immediately in my acknowledgments, were really like, they made me realize how big Chicago Heights really was
Hmm.
in Chicago, and then really how their reach was nationally. And for the second part of your question, what made me want to write a book? I felt like there was no more good mob stories or movies or series. And I really set out to kind of create one. and
Yeah.
as someone who was an options trader, and I'm still an options trader, I go down to the exchange every day. I decided to write a novel to create the next mob series because I knew Chicago Heights had a history. Um,
Yeah.
that I was familiar with through, stories, and then through other works of nonfiction. And, what makes a good story is something that someone kind of knows a little bit about, but told from a unique angle. And that's really what Chicago Heights has.
Yeah, it sure does. And if you dig in, and we're going to dig in a little bit to the history of the Heights, It is the Chicago Heights crew, which I would say some of the names that you would know became more prominent from maybe the 70s and 80s on. But historically, it has ties going back to Al Capone. There's actually a famous photo of what appears to be just a backyard family gathering. And a lot of people have trouble identifying, well, we know Al Capone sitting right in the middle of the photo,
Hmm.
but who are all these other kind of tough looking characters standing around Capone? And it turns out those are the boys from the Heights. And you can't research this topic if you go to Google and you type in Chicago Heights Mafia or Chicago Heights Crew. Your cousin's book, like you can't. There's no getting around it. It comes up
No,
front and center,
100%. Yeah.
and it's absolutely a book that I would recommend reading. It's pretty much, when it comes to this particular crew, which I think I said, maybe I didn't say, it was one of about 6 or 7 core crews for the outfit.
Mhm.
His book pops up front and center, so definitely worth reading. So
Yeah.
without further ado, so you made the decision to write the book.
Hmm.
Can you give listeners a little more? Just give us an overview of the book. What's the plot? Who are some of the main characters? And give us the pitch. Why should people read the book?
Well, so people, what they're going to get is they're going to really get kind of like a really inside view into kind of like how Chicago Heights kind of came about and what they had their fingers involved in. And it kind of gives you the point of view, really, of what it's like being inside of a family that's kind of been going through this, and how you got involved in maybe a life like this at the turn of the century. Um, so there's a little sociology involved in it, but it really, like, our main protagonist, Sal Liparello. At the beginning, he didn't really envision a life of organized crime, but by the time he's a late teen, um, he had a cousin, kind of like bring him in, and his dad really didn't push him away from it either. So it's kind of like gives you a really realistic inside view of how someone in the early 1900s, who didn't really maybe see himself as getting involved in something like this, ended up being one of the most powerful gangsters maybe in the nation by the mid 60s. And you know, people from the Heights knew who these guys were, but no one else did. So I kind of wanted to let people know who they were, but in a fictionalized manner. But like I said, if you were to read, and like you pointed out, a couple books about Chicago Heights history from 1910 to 1970, I think a reader would get a pretty good idea on the inspirations behind my characters. But it really takes readers into a historical. My book was actually a historical outline before I wrote fiction. So
Interesting.
almost every hit, every murder in my book is actually based on a real hit. I just fictionalized it.
So given that you had all of the history right there, what made you decide to
Mhm.
fictionalize it?
So a lot of FBI files that I went through, and then just a lot of stories that you had heard over the years were just like fantastic stories, whether
Mhm.
they were related to you or not. Because in Chicago Heights, you were related, or if you weren't related, they called you cousins because your families were so close, you were like cousins. So
Mhm.
everyone really just kind of knew everyone, and everyone protected everyone, which is why no one really know who anyone from the Heights was until 15 or 20 years ago. Um, so it really gives readers, I would say it's very much like a first person autobiographical look of, I mean, really a little known but very powerful voice in the
Mhm.
outfit in Chicago Heights and actually across the country.
unless you really, really, truly do your homework, the guys that were in the Heights, again, we're gonna cover that. You won't know unless you're a mob aficionado. But what I would liken the main character in your book to would be somebody like a Russell Buffalino, who was huge, huge in the underworld, but only guys in the underworld knew who he was until much, much later.
Yeah.
So somebody, your main character, Salvatore Liparello, incredibly, incredibly powerful, and it's almost a bit of a coming of age story where he, again, like you said, he doesn't start off to be a gangster. He just gets pulled in. He gets pulled in,
Yeah.
and he's in it pretty deep before he realizes what exactly he's in. But then once he's in, he realizes, I've got a talent for doing this, which also reminds me, if you've watched Godfather 2, very similar to Vito's story, where he gets pulled in, things happen, circumstances lead him down a path. But once he's on that path, he realizes he's smarter than the guy next to him. He's more cunning,
Yeah.
and that's essentially Salvatore Liparello.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And then what I did also like about the book is, in addition to kind of that first person perspective, you're also getting to know people like Al Capone. You're bringing in historical, like real historical figures alongside your fictional figures. So you get Al Capone, you definitely get Tony Accardo. Even later in the book, you get some other real life characters.
Elliot Ness.
Yeah, Elliot Ness,
Yeah.
Jimmy the Weasel,
Yep.
Frank Bompancero towards the
Hmm.
towards the end. I don't want to give everything away, but you do get some real people that kind of come in.
Oh,
And
yeah.
what I like about your book is it's almost like you're sitting there having a conversation with Al Capone, and it kind of makes you feel like this is what it must have been like to be there. So I definitely appreciated that particular part of it.
It's actually probably, I appreciate that.
Um, so I don't want to give away too much about the book. I want people to go out and buy it for themselves. But let's go behind the scenes. So can you explain the writing process to those like myself that are unfamiliar with it, and who maybe some people like myself out there want to write a book someday? What does that process look like from start to finish?
Sure. Well, because my idea was historical, and not a completely fictional, creation, I started off with a historical timeline. Um, and then what I decided to do is, what stories have I heard that were kind of like passed on from maybe grandparents to parents to me, or something maybe I just overheard on my own as a kid. Where and then how those fit into the timeline. And because I really, after talking to my cousin Matt, he who had already had a historical press, and we were both talking about how we wanted a new mob series, and we thought the Heights could deliver that. He's like, I'm not sure if I have the style to create the fiction around the, history. And we have had some conversations, and, he was kind of like, I think, you can do it. And of course I asked his permission to use his book as a huge baseboard, which, which I had his permission. So then I started kind of using that historical outline, and then I really just created out of that.
Mhm.
I just started creating. I maybe took multiple historical guys to create a character, or they were based directly off someone. And then I just really started trying to figure out how could I make these guys human.
Mhm.
It's hard because you write a gangster story. They're not likable people, right? They're megalomaniacs. They're
Mhm.
out for themselves. They're self-serving. And they'll run anyone over to get to their end line, right? So,
Yep.
racketeers aren't like lovable guys. So, trying to create a storyline and a character arc was quite difficult for all of these guys.
Mm-hmm.
My harshest critics was just we didn't like the characters, and honestly, I mean, I guess I could appreciate it if you're not into this.
Yeah.
So then I just started going from there. I didn't worry about any kind of formatting or anything like that. I just started creating the story. If I got stuck, um, I would kind of like create a mark, so I would go back to it. And I would just write. And that's it. I mean, that's my recommendation to anyone is just write. If it's outline it, because you got to have some kind of basis.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, like, I kind of do half writing when I'm doing character dossiers and stuff like that. I'm writing in a notebook, right? And then I'll go and start putting things down in Google Docs. But, my recommendation to anyone is outline it and then just write. And then when you're done, you're going to underestimate the number of times you will self-edit your work. So there's going to be plenty of times to go back and change things. So my recommendation is just write it and just do it, because you're going to edit more times than you're going to want.
How for you, did you have a background in writing before you decided to
No,
do this, or did you just jump right in?
I just jumped in. I always loved writing. I would take writing classes in high school and college as electives. But I kind of felt like I had to go into the business school route. So I kind of just took the path I thought was that I should take. But I always liked writing, and wasn't necessarily a reader though. Very much, I did
Interesting.
enjoy writing. I used to write songs and poems, but I just kind of like pushed that aside because I never saw myself as a creative.
Interesting.
And
And
then, yeah.
how long let's all right, I'm imagining a first draft. And forgive me, I forget exactly how many pages the book is, but how big of a draft do you have to make before you're like, all right, let's take this and pitch it to a publisher?
Okay. So that's one of the things that's a headache about submitting a manuscript is every publisher wants something different.
Hmm.
So I think for most people, you better be at least 80% done before you're going to submit. Um, I'd say the average novel is about 80,000 words, 70 to 80,000 words. I was right there.
Hmm.
Um, So that kind of put me right about 300 pages, roughly. 80,000 words is right around there. Um, and my publisher was like, well, what do you think about your ending? Um, and I'm like, well, I actually thought I left it kind of open-ended, maybe for a part two.
Hmm.
But I'm not really crazy about it, and I kind of wanted to talk to you guys about that. And they're like, well, actually, we don't like it. Can you continue the story and end it another way? And so I said, yeah, I can take the story from 1969 or 1968 to 71 and I can give it a more definite ending. And they're like, please do that. So at that point, I went from basically like a 300 word manuscript to a 330 page manuscript. So I added like
Hmm.
10%. And then after all editing, Jake, I think I'm right around like 285, 295.
Okay.
So they took out, a chunk.
And
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 that's
let's
really just I took you know what I took out like it was basically a short story they completely took
Mhm.
out. They're like that's an anecdote and that's almost like a separate mini series. No. Um,
Interesting.
but yeah, they just really just make things succinct and take don't need this, don't need this, and they just kind of give it the flow that a first time writer would want.
And I imagine there's a certain amount of when you're writing, especially for the first time, and you're going through the process, there's a certain amount of uh, ego that probably takes a bit of a beating as they're giving giving you feedback. Uh, but getting it ultimately to print, that's a big accomplishment for your first time. And what I would also say is, in the question I had is, well, how do you go from like, I've got a draft,
Hmm.
to, okay, how do you find a publisher, somebody willing to actually publish for you?
Submit, submit, submit.
Okay.
Um, so I was historical fiction, organized crime. So that's strike one. Because if you're organized crime, everyone wants nonfiction. It's an easier
Yep.
sell. Okay. So selling organized crime, historical fiction, even though someone called my book fictionalized history,
Hmm.
and they actually said it as a negative, but I think actually, if you're really a mob fanatic, you'd really take it as a compliment.
Yeah.
So if you really like, it's really fictionalized history, kind of, in my opinion. So you know, even though even though that's what it is, that's a hard sell. Um, so you just, and I did. I'm not a professional writer, and I wasn't going to pay an agent to submit for me. Um, so I was also submitting to agency publishers that
Hmm.
did not require an agent. So that put me like in an indie publisher. Um, Indie publisher, and the year of COVID was hard. Um, Everyone was inundated. So
Yeah.
9 months of no's or no reply at all. And then Blue Handle Publishing out of Amarillo, Texas, gave me a call. And they were the easiest to submit to. They just were like, send your entire manuscript. Um, they were not looking for anything in particular. A lot of houses were looking for something specific.
Hmm.
A lot of nonfiction, a lot of coming of age. They were looking for a lot of LGBTQ, which the Heights definitely is not.
Right.
So it was definitely a hard pitch for me. Um, People asked if I was going to self-publish. I thought about it, Jake. Um, but when I was writing this, I was calling it a project because I really like I was set out to create a series. Like I
Hmm.
wasn't out to create a bestseller. I created a novel so I can get it in front of the right guy, which I'm still trying to do, right? Or
Yeah.
or woman for that matter. Um, so that's kind of where I just started sending it off, and I'm like, what, if someone believes in this book and they're gonna back it, it'll hit stores and it'll hit shelves. But if everyone just tells me a no, then it'll be for my kids only. And I could say, hey, I wrote this manuscript, it never got published, but here it is. So if it didn't get published, that's what it was going to be. I
Yeah.
wasn't gonna I wasn't gonna self-publish it because I just wanted that validation.
Yeah.
Which is really, I mean, yeah, I want to sell books, but I mean, I gotta be honest, like getting the book published was like, that was like mission accomplished for me until I get the series. Now I'm off to like finish the game.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of, when you have that validation. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with self-publishing, but when you have
Absolutely
that
not.
validation of somebody saying this deserves to go to print, we're going to back it, we're going to help you promote it, and we're going to be invested in publishing it. Like, what more can you ask for as an author? And I just have to ask, what does it feel like to get it across the finish line, and to see, like, you've got the book right behind you, you can touch it, you can feel it, it's got your name on it. What does that feel like?
It's definitely a sense of accomplishment. Um, it's definitely something that you feel like something's not going to ever take it away from you. Um, and one of the reasons why I also chose to do a novel was because I had total creative licensing. I can create anything what I want. There's no one from Chicago Heights can come back to me and say anything about this or that or history. This is a novel, and it's for entertainment purposes,
Hmm.
and that's it. It's there to entertain. I'm not there to tell a story. You're the mob historian. Matt Luzzi's the mob historian. John Binder's the mob historian. Mario Gomez, who has the my Al Capone Museum website, which is
Yeah.
phenomenal. So yeah, and so that's it. I just was, plus the Chicago Heights had a relationship with Al Capone. No one knew about it. So I kind of
Yeah.
tried to throw that out there too.
So speaking of history, this is the Gangland History Podcast. So I definitely want to cover the history part of this because there's a lot of history to tell. As you were writing the book and you were coming from the perspective of a non-historian, what did you learn when you were researching the real history of the outfit, the real history of the Chicago Heights crew? And was there anything that you learned that maybe you didn't know before, or maybe connected to things that you had heard your family mention when you were a kid that kind of filled in some of the puzzle pieces for you?
All right. I'm going to try to go chronologically so I
Okay.
don't really miss anything. Let's start with Al Capone was always hanging out in Chicago Heights, or Al Capone had a house in Chicago Heights. Number one, Al Capone never did have a house in Chicago Heights, but he did spend a lot of time there, and he hid out in Chicago Heights crew's family's houses after the McSwiggins fiasco,
Mm-hmm.
and Fred Burke was hid out in Chicago Heights after. And there was always rumors that some of the guys in the Heights, quote unquote, cut their teeth in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. None of that ever could be proven until I would say, and they would, and I'm going to say what was possibly shown to be true was as Gomez and Luzzi and Binder started getting into that lawn photograph with
Mm-hmm.
Capone in Chicago Heights. You have guys in Chicago Heights there, but there's guys from all around the country there. There's guys from Detroit in that photo, and I think St. Louis in that photo, North Side gangs in that photo. So, and then it's proven that guys in that photo were players and shooters in the Valentine's Day Massacre. And because that photo was just taken months before the massacre, I'd say that was kind of somewhat of an aha moment that, yes, okay, maybe the guys in the Heights weren't pulling triggers in there, but Al Capone respected their level of intelligence and planning. And it was such a safe place to plan something of magnitude like that, that Chicago Heights was a place to do that. He had the brain power to plan it there, and he had the privacy there to plan something like that. So I think an aha moment in how Chicago Heights possibly and probably played a planning role in one of the most gruesome and historical,
Yeah.
mob massacres, St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Researching mob files, FBI files, reading about Sam Giancana, and I think was the MCA guy creating the top 40. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like, a lot of pop culture and music created out of the Chicago outfit and music moguls.
Yeah, the outfit was big in the entertainment industry over the course of time, and in the music industry. They had a lot of hooks in
Yeah.
people for sure.
Chicago FBI files stating that the special informant told special agent that Frank Laporte was mad that Johnny Roselli was ditching his phone calls. And so, like, here's Johnny Roselli, who's formerly of LA family, now tied to Chicago family. And at the time, when this is all going on, is working for the CIA, trying to kill
Mm-hmm.
Castro. But you got a guy from Chicago Heights in real
Of
life
all places.
keeping an eye on him for Tony Accardo. So
Yep.
Tony
And
Accardo has guys from the Heights because they go all the way back to Capone days and they're trusted. Like, you know,
and you
outfit guys put Chicago Heights guys in place of power because they were trusted and they knew how to do business.
and you mentioned one of the key names that if you do any research on the Heights, you're going to run into two primary names in terms of the early days. Frank Laporte, who is what I would say started off probably as the second in command, but eventually kind of took it
Or even
over.
third. third in
or even
command, even.
third,
Yeah.
and ran it into the 1970s. But then you've got a guy named Jimmy Emery. That's what he went by. But it was Vincenzo Ameratti. Emery, he was the main guy. He was the guy. He was the boss of the Heights from the 20s through the 40s. Between Laporte and Jimmy Emery, these were the guys in that picture, right up there with Capone. But these were the guys running the Heights and expanding the rackets, not just from the Heights, but all over nationally. They definitely went into Indiana from Chicago, but they also expanded nationally. Chicago Heights was a big hub for bootlegging. I believe Elliot Ness once said Chicago Heights was the pickup depot for most of the illicit alcohol trade in the entire Midwest. A lot of people, when they think of the outfit, they think of Cicero, but Chicago Heights, lesser known, might have actually been a bigger deal than Cicero, but was more kind of quiet.
I think Cicero and Chicago Heights, I may be mistaken, but I think I'm correct. They were the two wettest cities or towns during Prohibition. Cicero and Chicago Heights were like 1 and 2 both.
And the interesting thing, and you do get this throughout the book, but very much in real life, and I think it's pretty well known that Al Capone had a pretty large bankroll when it came to paying for police protection and political protection. And I'm not going to say that he got that idea from the guys in the Heights, but the Chicago Heights area, because they paid so well for police and political protection, they never really faced a serious case or serious pressure from law enforcement, especially in the early days, all the way up into the 70s, and it was like a fortress. And I believe Al Capone, maybe he learned something from them, or maybe
or vice versa.
It was definitely good advice, and they took it and ran with it and expanded the rackets, but also they had all of the police, all of the judges in their pockets. And they definitely got what they paid for in terms of the protection. Now, one of the interesting things about the Heights, also from a historical standpoint, is when you're in the 1920s and you're in that Capone era, there's a huge war and a fight for control going on in Chicago and all of the different suburbs of Chicago, right? You've got Al Capone, you've got the Irish in the north side, you've got the Jennas, you've got the Unione Siciliano, kind of trying to control and puppet everybody and everything. And the boys in the Heights, as they were called, is it true that they almost started as kind of a separate family, a separate crew, a separate entity from the outfit before they partnered?
That's actually 100% correct. Yeah. So Chicago Heights was not part of the outfit. They had their own boss in 1902. I think it was San Filippo, or I think that was his last name. And he was Sicilian, and he was political arm of the Union Siciliana. And almost all the gangs in Chicago Heights were led by Sicilians. But yeah, there was one little gang that was a crew of Calabrians, and they, they were not happy. This is where fiction and, it's like, we know that Capone went into Heights with Torrio and kind of like would go and check things out there. I mean, and we know for certain that Capone became friends with Dominic, Roberto, and Frank Laporte. So like we know that. And we also know that Capone was taking it all sides. And that Capone really wanted the lucrative, he saw what a cash cow the Chicago Heights territory was. And, I think it's probably realistic to think that Chicago Heights thought about staying independent, but Al Capone promised Dominic Roberto, who was one of his really good friends, you deliver me the Heights and I'll make you, a lieutenant, which he ended up doing. So people want to always ask, well, why did Chicago Heights not stay independent? And why did they join the outfit? And I think the way I explain that in my novel, I think that's really the only way. There's only really one really good explanation is common sense.
Yeah.
We got enough cash here. If we're friends with Al now, but if we say we're not going to be part of his outfit, we're going to be at war with him.
Yep.
So it's like, and I think they knew that Al was vivacious and he had the personality, and I just think they said, let him have it. We'll just let Chicago. I think they probably had a really good deal. I think Capone and Ricca and Accardo and Iupa, I think all those guys in the Heights got a killer deal. And so they were more than happy just to let, deliver it. So yeah, the Chicago Heights, it was a boom town, an Italian boom town, and they had their own boss. They did not answer to Chicago at all. But
And
they joined forces in the middle of the beer wars.
it's interesting. It's like, well, let him be the lightning rod. Let everybody go, go shoot it, go shoot at him.
Yep.
And we're just going to sit back and make money. And, maybe we'll lend some shooters here and there, which they certainly did to help Al and the organization take care of business. But their goal was to make money and not headlines. And they did that pretty well. Now, you mentioned a couple of other characters, so we all know eventually Al Capone is convicted of tax evasion, and that was the major relationship at the start for the Chicago Heights crew. But as you get into the 30s, 40s, 50s, and so on, we know that Accardo and Ricca were the guys running things for the most part. Now, of course, we all know the Frank Nitti thing from the 30s and into the 40s before he ultimately committed suicide. Ricca was the guy behind the scenes pulling strings, and then after that, it's Ricca and Accardo into the 1970s, with Accardo living out until the 1990s. So, what would you say the relationship between the guys in the Heights, Jimmy Emery, Frank Laporte, Dominic Roberto, with Ricca and Accardo in those early days? Was it similar to the relationship that they had with Capone, or was it
I would
different? Like,
No, I
yeah.
think it was. I think it was very close. Accardo would invite guys from the Heights to the, Fourth of July
Mhm.
extravaganzas he would have. Um, and I know Accardo would send a guy from Chicago Heights in the 50s and 60s to meet with the Mexican government. They were trying to set up gambling with Mexico, and the outfit was actually sending a little known Chicago Heights guy down there. So the fact that even into they were sending little known Chicago Heights guys there that were handpicked by you know um, Laporte or Emery, that they had that they knew who their core was. And I think anyone who came up with them, I think in the 20s and 30s and early 40s were like, I think they had an inseparable bond. And then the younger guys that were kind of coming up in the late 50s and 60s, like they were just like a different mentality. And I
Yeah.
think those older guys protected each other because, I was really an aha moment. In the late 60s, early 70s, Jimmy the Bomber Catuara is really pushing back against Frankie
Yep.
Laporte. And like, I'm reading these threats and FBI files, and like, Catuara's telling an informant, if any of Laporte's relatives think they're gonna, take over, they're gonna have me to deal with. So just to read that,
Mhm.
that's an also thing, like, you don't really understand, like, there was all these things that, like, the generation just below was just a lot different than all the Capone guys.
Yeah, and they especially when you're not first generation Italian, you're not like the difference between the guys coming up in 60s, 70s, and 80s, and what I would still consider kind of a golden era for the mob versus the guys in the early 1900s. is the guys in the early 1900s, in many cases, came from nothing. They came from absolutely nothing, and I'm not saying that that didn't happen in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but they're coming from another country. They're coming into a country where they're not looked upon kindly in most cases
Hmm.
by the people that are already there. They've got to fight for everything that they do have, and so there's this protective and secretive nature that comes from
Hmm.
where they just came from, in most cases, Sicily. And then prohibition happens and everything gets turned on its head. And these people that had nothing are all of a sudden the ones in power because they figured out, how to do all the bootlegging routes and how to make money out of bootlegging. And then they use that money to buy the political influence, which got them the power. But they still remained very, very clannish
Hmm.
all the way up. But when they started to die out, and you got second generation, third generation Italians who maybe didn't have to go through that struggle, who may still have been steeped in the ways of the life, but didn't have to go through that struggle in many cases of coming up from nothing. The values were just much different, and the the people that came here to begin with, sure there was a certain amount of glamour, but they had to do it. They didn't have, in many cases, a choice. It was either that or just be a nobody and
Hmm.
get just crushed under the weight of everything. Whereas the guys coming up in 50s, 60s, 70s, they see all these old gangsters, and they see what they're doing, the lifestyle that they're living, and they want to earn it much more quickly,
Yeah.
and without the same values that some of the older gangsters. Now they're all relative, like, they're all bad people. There just are bad people, right?
Yep.
But the value system was much different. The familial system was much different as you get on in the different eras. So
Yeah.
there's that friction between the two eras, and it's natural. Like every generation says the generation before it is not as good as our generation. They're lazy. They're this. They're that. They
Right.
don't respect the old values. But in this case, you could definitely see the friction between the generations and the
Yeah.
differences in the way that they were raised, and the struggles that they had to go through.
Yeah. The Capone era guys just had like an unspoken trust with one another.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Jimmy the Bomber Catuara comes up he's coming up in the 60s and 70s, and there is a character in the book. I'm not going to say which character, but that is very much modeled after Jimmy. Jimmy is, no surprise, killed violently in 1978, and eventually the Heights are taken over by a guy named Albert Tocco, um, and from there, the Chicago outfit, it's still very, very active, but it's not what it was in its
Yeah.
heyday. Certainly
No.
not what it was, and that's the mafia as a whole. From about the 80s on, has just slowly but surely deteriorated and begun to crumble, and it's certainly not in the golden age of criminality and making money, although they're still out there kind of doing their thing. It's much less than what it was before.
Yeah. It's more. I think they just run things through more legal channels now than they used to.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Literally, I think they run things just through legal channels now.
yeah,
So they're
Rico.
just a lot. They're just a lot smarter about how they're doing things.
Yeah, I heard somebody talking about this recently on another podcast. The mafia was so smart in the way that they built their structure from the 1930s all the way through the 60s and 70s, to the point where the government had to get smarter, to the point where the government had to pass what a lot of people believe is a semi-illegal law in the RICO law in
Hmm.
order to justify a legal way to bring the mafia to heel. And in the RICO law, in combination with, I would say, the change in values over the course of time and more informants, it's really brought it to heel, though it's not dead. So a couple of last questions. So
Sure.
we've talked a little bit about the book writing process. We've talked a little bit about the history, without naming names or anything like that, violating trust or privacy, what have been your most interesting experiences since you have officially written a published mob book?
I think probably one of the more interesting thing was at one of my two book launches, a couple relatives of a current big time outfit guy came to my book signing. I knew who they were, and they came in support, which was nice. They bought a copy, and they were looking forward to reading it. So, I think that that was kind of, when guys who are currently related to people who guys talk about on a daily basis in Facebook groups are at my book signing and asking me to sign them a copy. I think that's kind of cool, and I think that speaks to the authenticity of my book. I think it also shows that I don't think I do anything to upset anyone either. I definitely don't paint the Chicago outfit, or I don't paint anything in a positive light. I think it's very matter of fact, and some parts are gruesome. But I think when two relatives of an outfit bigwig are there to ask for a copy to sign it, I thought that was kind of cool. And I think I got to be honest, I feel the same, and my end result is to still sell this thing as a series. Because I really think like people read this book and it goes it spans 6 decades, and so I think people can understand on how I kind of try to lay it out there. But I think having a couple of those guys show up at my book signing, and really just having a publisher believe in the story was kind of just I don't want to say a big deal for me, but it kind of makes feel like what I did, that I did a good job at it, regardless of where it goes from here. Because the guys that showed up at the book signing, they know everything inside and out, and if they don't have a problem with it and they liked it, and they're looking forward to it, I hope everyone else is too.
We wouldn't be doing this interview if they had a problem with it.
Probably not.
They're walking in there going, we know that you know that we know that you.
Yeah, I think at one point he talked about maybe doing a version of his story, and I think we put that to bed as a big no way.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
That's risky. That's risky for everybody.
That's not gonna. No, I'm not touching that.
Yeah. I would say that's interesting. I've had similar validation of my work, much different context. Nobody's coming up to me at a book signing, but you get emails sometimes. Sometimes emails are saying you're an idiot and you've got this completely wrong, or you can't pronounce this name or that name. And I certainly do get my fair share of that. But every once in a while, there are people that are like, man, that are close to the life, that are like, you got that story about as close to how it actually happened as possible to get from the outside looking in. And I took that as a major.
Yeah. I mean, your Ricca podcast, I think everyone in Chicago knows you nailed that one. That guy was powerful and never want anyone to know who he was. And then I think when you talked about your podcast about state of the mafia in 1967, I was always told, but I never knew, Chicago doesn't make guys. Chicago doesn't make guys. You're just part of the outfit. You cut your teeth and you're in it, or you're not. And it was, you're in it or you weren't in it. So I'm not saying guys weren't made in Chicago, but guys in Chicago Heights were taught no, Chicago guys don't need to be made. So a lot of Chicago guys, I always thought that was kind of a New York thing. So
and it's interesting. digging through the paperwork, which if you're going to do a historical podcast, I don't know how you can do it any other way than to dig through paperwork and mounds and mounds. And quite frankly, most of the paperwork that I dig through, I would say 99 out of 100 pages are complete, like, rubbish, useless. Like, you can't use that information because it doesn't tell anybody anything. But every once in a while, you come across a report or a piece of information, and the light shines on it, and you're like, oh my God, this is amazing information. I've got to share this. And that was one of those things where you see the differences in making ceremonies, not just from city to city, because there's a big difference in the making ceremonies in New York versus Chicago, where it's literally like they circulate your name and it's all right, you're in.
Yeah.
Versus in New York, where they're pricking your finger, the gun and the knife, the burning of the saint, and all the pomp and circumstance. But even within New York, there are individual differences between the families and the way that they do things, and not just the families, but the eras. Things are done much differently now than they were in the 1930s and 1940s in terms of the ceremonies. And a lot of the reporting, which is coming from informants who were either made back in the day or made very recently and were informing. A lot of very interesting stuff if you take the time to go and find it. So, Ray, what other? I feel like maybe there are other questions that I haven't asked. What question haven't I asked that I should have asked?
You know what? I think another favorite tidbit I kind of like in the book was Eliot Ness.
Yeah.
I really kind of enjoyed telling a little story about him. When I was doing some research about my book, a guy that Matt Luzzi had researched an old time prohibition bootlegger in Chicago Heights in the late 1980s. And this guy was working for Roberto and Emery in LaPorte. And he got picked up by Ness's brother-in-law and some other guys that were busting Chicago Heights at the time, because it was considered like the second wettest city in the country by Ness. So what the guys were told to do is, listen, just sit tight, make the call. We'll be down in Joliet. We'll pay the guy off, and you'll be out of there. So just don't say a word. Just make your phone call, and we'll come and get you. So sure enough, this Chicago Heights bootlegger tells Luzzi, I got picked up by Ness. I'm sitting in the prison in Joliet, and my bosses came and paid Ness $350, and I walked out the door. So I thought that was a crazy story, because people love putting Eliot Ness. I'm not saying he wasn't a great crime fighter, but I'm saying he wasn't a great crime fighter. I'm saying he was out for himself. Yeah. So I really,
as the legend says.
Yeah, like everyone just loves, you hear all these reports of how he was, loved to drink in all the establishments he was looking to bust. He really was just out to take down to, Capone and make a name for himself. And then to have this, and I incorporate that firsthand story that was relayed to me in my book, because who has ever heard that side of Eliot Ness's crew? No one.
Right.
So I took a lot of joy actually in that, because I think Eliot Ness was whatever. I think history should just let the pieces fall, and let everyone be shown for what they are. And that's why I said gangsters aren't great people. So I wasn't out to make anyone out to look good or anything like that, but Chicago Heights really has a great history, and no one really knew about it. And, I really think that people who like mob books and mob shows, even though it's a novel, I think you could rest assured that you're going to get a very historical rendition of what took place, and because it took place, how it probably went down, right? Because like I said, all the hits are based on actual, mob hits but because they took place 50, 60, 40 years ago, I had to fictionalize how they went down. But the street corners where they, happened, like, I lay it all out for you. And, the beer wars, part of my novel is probably more fictional than not. The beer wars part of my book is really a blow by blow of really how I think it went down. And I have a couple great nonfiction sources that I really wasn't afraid to get my, a couple of the numbers I threw out in my book and some of the sociological factors. But what else do I think you could ask me? Is there going to be a part 2? I don't think so. I don't think so.
Once you read this book, you'll know, like, probably with this one, nah, not room for a part 2 unless you get into maybe the more modern.
It's the modern era, and you can kind of see right where I leave it off, because I know your history, and you know who I'm leaving. I kind of end it right when, like, the chop shop wars are getting ready to take over in reality. And to be quite honest, like I say, I'm not a historian. I don't know enough about that history even to start really fictionalizing it. I mean, if someone was to throw a bunch of money at me and be like, go do it, yeah, I'd be more than happy, and I could do it. But I tell you what, a lot of those families are still walking around Chicago Heights that were involved in that chop shop stuff, and I I'd be careful on.
Gotta be careful.
Yeah.
Somebody has told me first off, when I started this podcast, and I live in the Midwest, I don't come from a mob background. I don't come from anything even remotely close. And there were many people that said, I don't think that's a good idea. And I said, guys, it's 2020. It was 2021 at that time or something like that. And I was like, really, what's really going to happen? And then in talking with people, I was told, as long as you stick to the history, you'll be okay. And I'm like, well, what is that? What does that mean? I'll be okay. But everything's been okay, and I stick to the history. But whenever I brush up against something where the players are still out there and potentially alive and could do something back, that's kind of where I personally have drawn my line. So that's why I like to go back a little bit farther in history. Not to say that people's families still aren't out there. I've been contacted many times by family members of people that I've covered, but as they say, the ink is dry on that history for sure.
And so, Ray, what, Jake?
Yeah.
One thing too, a lot of these guys in early history kind of got into this life because, like you said, like, why'd they do it? They didn't have a better choice. They came from poverty. But, guys who maybe got into this life in the 70s and 80s or 90s, like they're in for it for a different reason. And like that's the reason why you don't need to mess around with those guys.
Exactly.
That's a different mentality, and it's a different game. And honestly, like, their stories at this point, it's not even worth telling at this point. So it's like, don't even waste your time.
So, Ray, where can people find you? Where can people go buy the book?
Well, they could find me at the Heights novel or writer Ray Franze. Writer Ray Franze is TikTok. Heights novel is Facebook and Instagram. You can find a little bio about me, bluehandlepublishing.com. The book's for sale on Amazon. I think the hardcover is actually on sale for under $18. I think the paperback's on sale for somewhere under $15. You can get it on Barnes & Noble. You could have it shipped to your favorite local bookshop at bookshop.org. So really, it's not too hard to find.
Yeah, and what I'll do for anybody that's interested, I will make sure that I link the book on Amazon, as well as all of the sites Ray just mentioned, in the description of the video on YouTube, as well as on the podcasting platforms. That way, if you want to go buy it, it's right at your fingertips. I highly recommend it. It is different than your traditional mob book. Most mob books are straight up nonfiction. In this case, it's a very interesting take on mob history, But you guys know me, I'm a historian. I'm all about the history. And if you do the research, you will find that this is not historical fiction. It's very accurate historical fiction. So definitely recommend going out and buying the book if you can.
Thank you, Jake.
All right, so let's go ahead and close the show. It was another great show. We've got some good stuff coming down the pipe. Again, we're gonna have at some point, and again, I'm not exactly sure in the order of which the order of which episodes are going to be published. Sometimes I record early and move the actual episode back in terms of the order. So you can expect in the near future, Ricca Part 2. I've already got all the content developed, just have to record it. The State of the Mafia 1967 Part 2. There's a ton more stuff to go there. And then I've got some paperwork on Pittsburgh boss John LaRocca that I'm itching to get into, Frank Balistreri, and maybe even some of the Kansas City guys. So I'm kind of bouncing around the country. I've got a lot of interesting stories to tell, and I'm trying to figure out how to tell them much faster and, like Ray's publisher, much more succinctly. But as I end every show, I just want to say thank you for everybody for watching and supporting me. We're coming up on 11,000 subscribers on YouTube, which I never thought I would get to 100. Now we were at 10,000. We're coming up quickly to 11,000. So just hope to keep growing. And I'm just very thankful for everybody that takes the time to listen to me. But as I end every show, grazie.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Gangland History Podcast. If you'd like to donate to the show, check out our Patreon channel. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe to help the channel grow. If you're an audio-only listener, subscribe via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Until next time, don't forget to keep your mouth shut.